Violette1st, the ultimate family freakout 5.0. Introduction. Hello and welcome to the 5th installment of Tuffo. This has 10,408 words of story. This is shorter, however in Tuffo 6.0 I will compensate for the shortness with about 60,000 words. This story is based off the YouTube channel called Violette1st. With that out of the way, I am explaining 3 things before the story begins. Warning and recommendation. If you find the following topics make you feel uncomfortable, then click off this video immediately. Those topics are guns, arson, blowing stuff up, cursing, fighting, random destruction, physical harm, punishment days and the mentions of people saying sus remarks. Then click off the video. This video is for entertainment purposes only. Main characters in Tuffo 5.0, Violette, Bill and William. Violette is the mother. Bill is the father. William is Violette and Bill's teenage son. One quick thing, if I refer to something called the boys, I am referring to Bill and William. I am using this as a shorter term. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a peaceful August morning in Mount Airy, Maryland. Violette is getting up for the day. A few seconds later Violette walks into William's bedroom. A few seconds later Violette tells William to wake up. William ignores Violette because he doesn't want to wake up for summer school. A minute later Violette drags William's blanket off his bed. William then wakes up. A few seconds later Violette and William walk downstairs. 30 minutes later Violette and William get into Violette's SUV. A minute later Violette and William speed off to Mount Airy High School. A few minutes later William walks into MAHS for his summer school. A few seconds later the headmaster called Zach comes out. A few seconds later Zach greets William. A few seconds later Zach and William walk to Zach's office. A minute later Zach and William have a chat. An hour later William walks off to his class. A few minutes later William gets a packet from his summer teacher called Patrick. A few seconds later William and Patrick go over the packet. A minute later William sees he has to write an 8-page essay on why Texas isn't dumb. A few seconds later William rips his packet in half. A few seconds later William runs out of the classroom. A few seconds later William gets tackled by a security guard. William is then dragged against his will. A minute later William sits down in his assigned seat in Patrick's class. A minute later William sincerely apologizes many times. A few seconds later William and Patrick discuss a plan on how to tackle the packet. A few minutes later William starts to complete the packet. 10 minutes later Patrick and William make a plan on how to tackle the 8-page essay. A few minutes later William starts speed writing. An hour later William hands his packet into Patrick. A few seconds later William is let out for lunch. A few seconds later William walks to the cafe. An hour later Violette picks up William. They then speed home. A few minutes later Violette and William walk into the house. A few seconds later Violette watches William run upstairs. A few minutes later Violette hears negative words coming from William's pie hole. Violette then tells William to use more friendly remarks. William then stops cursing like a sailor. A few seconds later Violette sits on the couch. 4 hours later Violette walks into the kitchen. A few minutes later Bill walks into the house. A few seconds later Bill walks to his scale. A minute later Bill's talking scale says Bill weighs 170 pounds of weight. A few seconds later Bill walks into the kitchen. Violette then serves Bill some steak tips. William then walks downstairs. A few seconds later Violette hands William some steak tips. Bill then grabs William's dinner. A few seconds later Bill starts eating William's steak tips. Violette then sighs. William asks if there is anything left. Violette tells William there are no more tips left. William then stomps away. A few seconds later William walks upstairs. 10 seconds later William opens his arson chest. William then grabs a bottle of lighter fluid, microfiber towel and a box of matches. A few seconds later William walks downstairs. A few seconds later William runs outside. Violette then sits down at the kitchen table to have a chat with Bill. 3 seconds later William places his fire starting materials in front of Bill's car. A few seconds later William squirts lighter fluid into Bill's car. A few seconds later William lights up a match. A few seconds later William torches the microfiber towel. 10 seconds later William places the flaming towel into Bill's car. A few seconds later William squirts lighter fluid onto the flaming towel. A few seconds later a massive fire engulfs the car. Violette and Bill then walk outside. Bill then starts roaring at William when he sees lighter fluid in William's hand. A few seconds later Bill runs to grab the garden hose. Violette then starts screaming gibberish. A few seconds later Bill starts dousing the car fire. William then starts throwing rocks at the car. A few seconds later William starts flipping out at Bill. A minute later Bill finishes dousing the fire. Bill then sprays William with the hose. A few seconds later Violette turns the hose off. A few seconds later Violette and the boys head into the house. A minute later Violette and Bill get into a massive argument for no reason. William then runs upstairs to his bedroom. A few seconds later Violette and Bill get into a nasty brawl. 8 minutes later Violette and Bill stop fighting. A few seconds later they walk upstairs. A minute later Violette and the boys fall asleep. 8 hours later Violette and William wake up. A few seconds later they walk downstairs. A few seconds later Violette walks into the bathroom. A few seconds later William steals Violette's credit card from Violette's hand purse. 15 minutes later Violette and William speed off to MAHS. 6 minutes later William walks into MAHS. A few seconds later William walks to Patrick's class. 10 minutes later William asks if he can use the restroom. Patrick then gives William the green light. William then walks away. A few seconds later William starts running. 30 seconds later William walks out of MAHS. A few seconds later William walks away. A few minutes later William walks into a Chuck E. Cheese's restaurant. A few seconds later William orders 3 pizzas. A few minutes later William pays with Violette's stolen credit card. A minute later William sits at a table. 8 minutes later William starts eating 3 pizzas. 10 minutes later William starts playing arcade games. Meanwhile, Patrick is getting impatient. A few seconds later Patrick walks over to Zach's office. A minute later Patrick explains the situation. Zach then sighs. A few seconds later Zach grabs his mobile phone. Meanwhile Violette is doing the dishes. A few seconds later Violette grabs her phone when it goes off. A few seconds later Violette sees Zach is calling. Violette then answers it. A few minutes later Violette hangs up. Violette then speeds off to MAHS. 6 minutes later Violette walks into Zach's office. A few seconds later Violette grabs her wallet. A minute later Violette sees her credit card is missing. Zach then asks Violette to check her bank statement. Violette does so. 3 minutes later Violette shows Zach that there were 3 charges made from Chuck E. Cheese's made in the past hour. Zach then asks Violette to drive to the Chuck E. Cheese's. Violette says she will be back shortly. A few seconds later Violette sprints to her SUV. Capital A. Minute later Violette speeds off to the closest Chuck E. Cheese's. Meanwhile William is having the time of his life. A few minutes later William hears a very loud scream. A few seconds later William sees Violette. A minute later Violette and William get into a fight. 3 minutes later they speed back to MAHS. 12 minutes later Violette and William walk into Zach's office. A few seconds later Zach starts roaring at William for cutting class, stealing Violette's credit card, lying and sneaking off to Chuck E. Cheese's. William then tries to lie his way out of the trouble he got into. Violette then tells William to be quiet. William bites Violette's hand. A few seconds later Zach says William has one more chance or else he will be held back and have to redo the 11th grade again. William screams at the top of his lungs with pure anger. Violette then tells William that he better behave for his final day, which is tomorrow. A few seconds later Violette drags William to the SUV. 3 minutes later they speed home. 1 minute later Violette and William walk into the house. A few seconds later William sprints upstairs. A few seconds later William gets into a round of Fortnite. 2 minutes later William gets eliminated from fall damage because he forgot to deploy his parachute. 1 minute later William gets into another round. 3 minutes later William gets eliminated from a stranger. William then screams with all his might. William then gets into a third round. 8 seconds later William starts raging at his teammates on his team. A few seconds later William screams I will hunt you down in real life, then murder your entire family and strangle you to death. William then keeps screaming verbal death threats towards his teammates. A few minutes later Violette walks back into the house after doing some maintenance with their boat. A few seconds later Violette hears William's death threats. Violette then turns the internet router off. A few seconds later William disconnects from the Xbox and video call from his teammates. A few seconds later William rips his headset apart. William then stomps downstairs. A few seconds later William grabs Violette's car keys. A minute later William gets into Violette's SUV. William then locks the doors. 3 seconds later Violette tries reasoning with William. A few seconds later Bill's truck pulls up. William then speeds off. Bill then gets out of his truck. A few seconds later Bill asks Violette if they can eat at a buffet for lunch. Violette says William stole the SUV. A few seconds later Bill screams with anger. 3 minutes later William parks the SUV in front of the house. A few seconds later Violette pushes William to the grass. William then slams onto the grass. A minute later Violette and the boys get into the SUV. 1 minute later they speed off to a buffet. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the buffet. A few seconds later they get served a table. A minute later Violette and the boys order their beverages. Bill asks for 8 glasses of water. 2 minutes later a waiter gives the Anderson family their beverages. A few seconds later Bill speeds off to the food. 4 minutes later Bill returns to the table with 4 plates overflowing with American Chinese cuisine. A few seconds later Violette and William tuck into their meal that is only 1 plate of food each. A few seconds later Bill starts speed eating his 6-pound meal. 8 minutes later Violette asks for the check. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk to the SUV. A minute later Violette and the boys speed home. A few minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the house. A few seconds later William grabs Violette's car keys out of Violette's hand. He then steals Violette's wallet. A few seconds later William runs out to the SUV. A few seconds later William gets into the SUV. 2 seconds later William locks the doors and trunk closed. A minute later William speeds off. 3 seconds later Violette and Bill start screaming with anger. 47 minutes later William walks into the house with a bag from GameStop. Violette then roars at William for buying a headset and 8 video games. Violette then screams at William for spending $800. A few seconds later William walks upstairs to his bedroom. A few seconds later Violette hears William slam his bedroom door closed. Violette then watches TV. A few minutes later Violette hears even scarier death threats coming from William. A few seconds later Violette turns the TV off. Violette then walks upstairs to confront William. 10 seconds later Violette hears William say a swear. Violette then screams with all her might. A few seconds later Violette walks into William's bedroom. 3 seconds later Violette starts scolding William. A minute later William pushes Violette out of his bedroom. William then continues screaming at his Xbox. A few seconds later Violette walks downstairs. 8 seconds later Violette walks outside. A few seconds later Violette speeds off somewhere in her SUV. An hour later Violette walks back into the house. Violette then walks up to William's bedroom. A few seconds later Violette walks into William's bedroom. A few seconds later Violette hands William a sponge and some towels. Violette then tells William it is his turn to wash the dirty dishes. William screams with pure anger. Violette then threatens William with the internet router. William gives in as he powers down his video game stuff. Capital A. Minute later they walk downstairs. 12 seconds later William rips the dishwasher door open. Violette then asks William to be gentle. William then starts placing dishes into the dishwasher in the wrong order. A few seconds later Violette tells William that he has to take the rack out. Violette then corrects William on how to properly load the dishwasher. 2 seconds later William chucks a plate to the floor. Half a second later a china plate smashes on the floor. Violette then stares into William's soul with utter anger. Violette then gives William the death stare. A few seconds later Violette starts screaming at William for smashing a dish. Violette watches with anger while William smashes more china dishes. 8 seconds later Violette hands William a broom, mop, bucket of soapy water and a dustpan. A few seconds later William starts breaking the dishes in the sink with the broom. A few seconds later Violette starts scolding William. A few seconds later Bill walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later Bill sees Violette is spanking William. A few seconds later Bill starts cleaning up the mess. A few minutes later Bill asks Violette for supper. Violette tells Bill they are going to Captain Grill. Violette says they will go shortly. 8 minutes later Violette finishes spanking William. Violette and the boys then get into the SUV. A few seconds later they speed off to Captain Grill. 40 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into Captain Grill. A few seconds later they ask for a table. A minute later they sit down at a table. 3 seconds later Violette and the boys order their beverages. 10 minutes later Violette and William each order a veal tomahawk chop. Bill then orders 9 of everything. A few seconds later their waiter walks away. Violette then screams at Bill for ordering a banquet. 10 minutes later Bill starts sweating because his food isn't out yet. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill to grow up. 80 minutes later Bill starts whimpering like a dog. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill to behave himself. 30 minutes later their food finally comes out. Bill screams with excitement. 3 minutes later Bill starts eating his meal. 10 minutes later Bill finishes eating as much food as his body can handle. Violette then roars at Bill for eating 8 pounds of food and for wasting 74 pounds of food. A few seconds later Violette nags Bill for planning on eating 82 pounds of food. A minute later Violette scolds Bill for wasting everyone's time. A few minutes later Violette and the boys drive home after paying for the $62,457 bill. 80 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the house. Violette then punches Bill for wasting 4 hours of her and William's time. A few seconds later Violette and William stomp upstairs. A few seconds later Bill plans on staying up the entire night. 8 hours later Violette wakes up. A minute later Violette and William walk downstairs to a foul stench. A few seconds later Violette sees Bill is passed out on the sofa, with piles of trash everywhere. William then sees Bill. A few seconds later William gags. Bill then wakes up. Violette then hands Bill a bag of cleaning supplies. A few seconds later Violette says she wants the living room to be spotless. Violette then asks Bill how much food he ate. Bill says he ate about 12 pounds of artery clogging junk. Violette then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Violette starts nagging Bill. William then sees the kitchen. A few seconds later Violette walks into the kitchen. 3 seconds later Violette sees the kitchen is in absolute disarray. Violette then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Bill grabs his truck keys. Bill then grabs his work bag. A few seconds later Bill tries to walk outside. Violette then tells Bill he needs to pitch in and help clean up. Bill then throws away one wrapper. A few seconds later Bill walks away. 1 minute later Bill speeds off to his workplace while having a foul odor, bacteria-thriving teeth, vile-looking clothes, moldy nails and crusty dandruff all over his hair. A few seconds later Violette and William start cleaning up after Bill's nighttime feast. An hour later Violette and William speed off to MAHS. 2 minutes later William walks into Patrick's class for his final day of summer school. 4 hours later Violette picks up William. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the house. Violette then hugs William for moving on to senior year after having to repeat the 11th grade. A few seconds later Violette and William eat lunch. 10 seconds later Violette hears the front door crash into a wall. Less than half a second later Bill stomps inside. A few seconds later Bill grabs a pot off the stove. Bill then storms away with the 8-pound pot of lasagna soup that Violette made for lunch. A minute later Bill speeds back to his workplace. Violette then sighs with anger. A few seconds later Violette washes the dishes. William then runs upstairs. 2 minutes later William starts screaming verbal death threats at his Xbox. A few seconds later Violette screams with pure anger. A second later Violette walks over to the stairwell. 2 seconds later Violette screams for William. A few seconds later Violette screams at William to get his booty downstairs. William then storms downstairs. A few seconds later William hisses Violette. A few seconds later William stomps back up to his bedroom. 4 seconds later William slams his bedroom door closed. 3 seconds later Violette sighs. As she walks to the couch. A minute later Violette starts watching SpongeBob SquarePants. 10 minutes later Violette calls for William. William walks downstairs. A few seconds later Violette tells William they are going back to school shopping. A few seconds later Violette grabs her car keys. A few seconds later Violette drags William outside against his will. A minute later they speed off to Walmart. 12 minutes later William and Violette walk into the Walmart. William then grabs a shopping cart. 2 seconds later William speeds away with his cart. A few seconds later William starts throwing random school supplies into his shopping cart. 3 minutes later William finishes placing school supplies into his cart. A few seconds later William then starts pushing school supplies to the floor just because he hates school. 3 minutes later William walks with his cart to find Violette, leaving the school supplies aisle in disarray. A few seconds later William finds Violette. Violette then asks William why there are staff running to the school supplies area. William then pushes his shopping cart over, which causes school supplies to flood the floor. William then runs away. 2 seconds later Violette walks over to the school supplies aisle. 20 seconds later Violette sees the extent of what William has done. William then runs back to the school supplies aisle. A few seconds later Violette starts raging at William. A few seconds later Violette and William get banned by the manager. William then runs away. 2 seconds later Violette starts chasing William. A few minutes later Violette finishes chaining down William to the roof of the SUV. A few seconds later Violette speeds home. 10 minutes later Violette starts to unchain William. 10 minutes later Violette puts her chains back into her chain chest. Violette then puts her chain chest into the trunk of her SUV. A few seconds later Violette and William walk into the house. A few seconds later Bill comes out of the bathroom. Bill then asks Violette for supper. Violette tells Bill she needs to discipline William. A few seconds later Violette grabs a belt off her belt rack. A few seconds later Violette starts whipping William's booty with the belt. 3 minutes later Violette washes her hands. A minute later she starts cooking dinner. 3 minutes later Bill asks for supper. A few seconds after Violette tells Bill to shut up. Bill then sits in his chair. A few minutes later Violette and William tuck into some pasta salad. Bill then walks outside. A few minutes later Bill walks inside with a boneless ham. A few seconds later Bill starts shoving 5 pounds of ham down his throat. A few minutes later Violette roars at Bill for eating 5 pounds of ham. A few seconds later Bill walks away. A few seconds later Violette and William finish eating. Violette then walks into the living room. William runs upstairs. A few seconds later William starts raging on his Xbox. 10 seconds later Violette sits on the couch. 2 minutes later Bill turns the internet router off. A few seconds later William grabs gasoline and a blowtorch from his arson chest. 1 minute later William walks outside with a bottle of gas, blowtorch and Bill's iPhone. A few seconds later Bill starts cussing up a storm. Violette then runs outside while William torches Bill's iPhone. A few seconds later Bill walks outside with a BB gun. A few seconds later Bill shoots William's booty. William yelps in pain. Violette then kicks Bill's genitals. Bill yelps in pain. Half a second later Bill falls onto the street. He then safely lands on his carcass. 3 seconds later Violette dumps a bucket of water onto the flaming phone. A few seconds later Violette and William walk into the house. 3 seconds later William locks the front door closed. A few seconds later Violette screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Bill speeds off to his office. William then sighs because he wanted to prank Bill. Violette then unlocks the door. A few seconds later William turns the router back on. William then runs upstairs. 3 seconds later Violette crashes onto the sofa. A few seconds later Violette sets a 30-minute timer. 8 seconds later Violette falls asleep. 8 minutes later William starts mega raging. A few seconds later William gets eliminated. William then kicks his TV. William walks downstairs while realizing his mistake. A few seconds later William grabs Violette's hand purse. William then sneaks out of the kitchen door. A minute later William powers up the SUV. 3 seconds later William speeds off. 18 minutes later Violette's alarm goes off. However she sleeps through it. 20 minutes later William walks into the house with a massive rectangular box. A few seconds later William places Violette's hand purse in the spot where he found it. William then starts dragging his box up the stairs. 10 minutes later William finishes setting up his 83-inch 4K UHD OLED Samsung TV. 3 minutes later Violette wakes up to a mysterious phone call. Violette then sees her bank is calling. Violette then answers the call. A few minutes later Violette hangs up the call. Violette then runs upstairs. 10 seconds later Violette rips up the box that came to William's TV. A few seconds later Violette realizes that she can't return the TV. Violette then screams with pure anger. Violette then walks downstairs. A minute later Bill walks into the house. 3 seconds later Bill asks Violette if they can go to Burger King for supper. Violette then agrees. A few seconds later Violette shouts William. Get your booty down these steps right now. You have 8 seconds to get downstairs. If you don't come down, I am going to drive over the internet router. We are having dinner, right this second, so get your booty downstairs because we are going to Burger King. William then sprints downstairs. A few seconds later Violette grabs her hand purse. A minute later Violette and the boys speed off to Burger King. 8 minutes later Violette parks the car in the Burger King parking lot. A few seconds later Bill races inside. A few seconds later Bill orders 8 triple hoppers, 9 large fries, 7 8-piece nuggets and 4 large sodas. A few seconds later Violette and William place their orders. A few moments later Bill asks for 8 Hershey's Sundae pies. The cashier then says they are out of chocolate chips and Cool Whip. Bill then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Bill runs into the kitchen. 3 seconds later Bill finds a steel axe. Bill then starts smashing the deep fryer. A few seconds later Bill starts smashing everything in the kitchen. 2 minutes later Bill starts smashing up the soda machines. 1 minute later Bill places his axe on the floor. A few seconds later Violette and William walk over to Bill. 2 minutes later Violette and the boys speed home. 4 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the house. A few seconds later Violette and William start exploding their heads off at Bill. Bill then says he will never misbehave again. Violette and William then storm upstairs without saying anything. A minute later Violette throws a sleeping bag and pillow down the stairs. A few seconds later Violette slams the door shut. 8 hours later Violette and William walk downstairs. A few seconds later Violette sees Bill is passed out on the floor. A few seconds later Bill wakes up. Violette then screams at Bill for eating an entire 7-pound turkey. Bill then gets up. A few seconds later Bill walks away. 3 minutes later Bill speeds off to his work while looking like a caveman. 3 seconds later Violette tells William it is his first day of senior year. William then screams with pure anger. 10 minutes later Violette and William speed off to MAHS. 8 minutes later William gets his schedule. A few seconds later William sees he has Mr. Green for his Calculus 1 class. A few seconds later William walks to his homeroom. A few minutes later William walks over to Mr. Green's math class. A minute later Mr. Green starts speaking. 10 minutes later Mr. Green hands out a packet to the class. A few seconds later William screams with pure anger. William then grabs his backpack. 2 seconds later William storms out of the class. A few seconds later William walks out of MAHS. William then starts walking home. 20 minutes later William walks into the house. 4 seconds later Violette starts nagging William. A few seconds later William says he is never going back to the prison called MAHS. Violette then drags William to the SUV. 3 minutes later Violette drags William into MAHS. 2 minutes later Violette and Zach start nagging William. William then starts ranting about why he hates MAHS. A few minutes later William sits down in Mr. Green's class. William then rips his packet apart for no reason. 1 second later Mr. Green tells William to march down to Zach's office. A few seconds later William flips off Mr. Green. William then walks to Zach's office. A minute later Zach asks William why he is here. A few seconds later Zach gets a phone call from Mr. Green. 2 minutes later Zach starts scolding William. 1 minute later Zach tells William he has one more chance before a suspension. William then walks back to Mr. Green's class. 2 minutes later William sits down in his assigned seat. 3 seconds later Mr. Green demands for an apology. William apologizes. Mr. Green then asks why. William says I am sorry that you are stuck in a dead-end job with no life. Mr. Green then calls Zach. A minute later Zach drags William to his office. 2 minutes later Zach says he will be calling Violette. William screams at the top of his lungs with terror. A few seconds later Zach starts to call Violette. 6 minutes later Violette sprints into Zach's office with a whip. A few seconds later Violette pushes William to the floor. 3 seconds later Violette starts whipping William's booty. A minute later Violette finishes whipping William. Violette and Zach then start discussing a plan for William. A few minutes later Zach tells William that he is about to be expelled for his negative behavior in the past hour. A few seconds later Violette gives William her death glare. A few seconds later Violette and William are dismissed. 2 minutes later Violette and William speed home. 8 minutes later Violette and William walk into the house. 2 seconds later William speeds upstairs to his bedroom. 4 minutes later William starts screaming his head off. A few seconds later Violette screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Violette unplugs the internet router. A few seconds later William throws his headset to the floor. A minute later William walks downstairs with Violette and Bill's bedroom TV. A few seconds later William walks outside with the TV. A few seconds later Violette follows William. 10 seconds later William throws his parents' TV into the Anderson family pool. Half a second later Violette starts nagging William about money. William then jumps into the pool. A minute later William drags the TV away. 2 minutes later William drives over the TV with Violette's SUV. William then speeds off. Half a second later Violette screams with pure anger. 3 minutes later William parks the SUV in front of the house. A few seconds later Violette starts scolding William. A few seconds later William walks inside. A few seconds later William walks upstairs after turning the router back on. Violette then starts to cook lunch. 3 seconds later Bill walks into the house. 2 seconds later Bill screams for lunch. Violette says lunch will be ready in 10 minutes. Bill then sits down in his chair. 10 minutes later Bill grabs a bowl. A few seconds later Bill starts chugging some chili. A minute later William walks downstairs. A few seconds later William asks for lunch. A few seconds later Violette dumps the pot of chili into the sink for no reason. William then walks away. A minute later William starts mega raging at his Xbox. A few seconds later Violette and Bill watch TV in the living room. A few seconds later Bill hears a no word. 10 seconds later Bill turns the router off. A few seconds later William disconnects from his Xbox. A minute later William walks outside with a blowtorch and a bottle of lighter fluid. 3 seconds later Violette speeds outside. A few seconds later William finds Bill's trash bag filled with chocolate and chips. 2 minutes later William torches the bag of junk food. Bill then screams with anger. A few seconds later Violette starts dousing the fire. 2 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the house. A few seconds later Violette starts berating William about his behavior. William then walks upstairs. A few seconds later Bill asks Violette for a light snack. Violette then asks where. Bill says he wants to have Starbucks for his light snack. Violette then unwillingly agrees. A few seconds later William speeds downstairs. 1 minute later Violette and the boys speed off to a Starbucks. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into the Starbucks. 10 seconds later Bill starts placing a massive order. 3 minutes later Bill finishes placing his $975 order. A few seconds later Violette and William place their orders. A minute later Violette grabs her wallet to pay for the order. A few seconds later Bill grabs a brownie bag he got. Bill then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Bill starts cursing at the worker who got his brownie. William starts a live stream on YouTube that is recording Bill. The worker then starts crying because of Bill's words. A minute later a manager speeds to the register. Bill then tells the manager to fire the crying worker. The manager then says she is only 15 and still a trainee. Bill then starts cursing at the manager because his brownie wasn't warmed. A few seconds later Bill starts screaming very demeaning words towards the staff working. A few seconds later Violette tries to intervene. Bill then starts dancing like a complete idiot. A few seconds later Bill throws his brownie to the floor. A few seconds later Violette starts to get upset. 1 second later William sees the stream has 18,000 viewers. Bill then starts to destroy other people's orders. A few moments later the manager tells the staff to escape through the emergency exit. A minute later the fire alarm goes off. Bill then starts twerking. A few minutes later a fire truck pulls up. A few seconds later several firefighters walk into the Starbucks with fire extinguishers. 3 seconds later a police officer walks in. A few seconds later William ends the stream. William then shows the officer everything that Bill did. 8 minutes later Bill gets detained. Violette then sighs with utter embarrassment. A few minutes later the Anderson family is told they have to pay $20,000 in restitution to the Starbucks and $7,000 to each of the 15 workers he harassed. Violette then screams with anger when she realizes they have to pay $125,000. A few seconds later Violette and William drag Bill away. 2 minutes later Violette starts chaining down Bill to the roof of the SUV. A few minutes later Violette closes her chain chest. 2 minutes later Violette and the boys speed home. 10 minutes later Violette starts unchaining Bill. 8 minutes later Violette puts her chains back into her chain chest. A minute later Violette and Bill walk inside. Violette then grabs her thickest belt off her belt rack. A few seconds later Violette pushes Bill to the floor. Half a second later Bill slams onto the floor. 3 seconds later Violette starts whipping Bill's booty with the belt. A few minutes later Violette starts whipping Bill's booty even harder. 8 minutes later Violette finishes whipping Bill because she hears William has started screaming blatantly offensive comments. A few seconds later Violette walks upstairs. 10 seconds later Violette starts roaring her head off at William. William then punches Violette. Violette then explodes at William for the punch. A minute later Violette walks downstairs. A few seconds later Violette watches TV. 2 hours later Violette walks into the kitchen. 40 minutes later Violette and Bill tuck into some steak. A few seconds later William asks for supper. Violette then tells William that ungrateful violent bastards don't get supper. A few seconds later William walks to the living room. A minute later William starts watching Jawtooth. 10 minutes later Violette and Bill join William for a Jawtooth marathon. 3 hours later Violette and the boys head to bed. 9 hours later Violette and William walk downstairs. 3 minutes later Violette and William tuck into some cold Cheerios for breakfast. 10 minutes later Violette hands a bowl of cold Cheerios to Bill. Bill then eats his breakfast. A minute later Bill speeds off in his truck. A few seconds later Violette watches TV. 10 seconds later William races upstairs. 2 hours later Violette turns the TV off. She then falls asleep for a while. 1 hour later Bill walks into the house. Violette then wakes up. A few seconds later William wanders downstairs for a snack. A few seconds later Bill hands Violette and William slips of paper. Bill tells them they are going on a vacation to Florida for 1 month. Violette and William scream with excitement. Bill then says their cab is coming in 30 minutes. A few seconds later Bill hands William his assignments that he will have to do. Bill then tells William he has to stay caught up in his 9 academic classes. William then looks at Violette. 2 seconds later Violette and William get up. 1 second later they race down the basement stairs. A few seconds later Violette and William speed upstairs with neon yellow suitcases. A few seconds later Violette gives Bill a suitcase. Then the Anderson family start to pack their clothes. 8 minutes later Violette and the boys race downstairs. A few seconds later Violette races down to the basement. A minute later Violette flies upstairs with 4 neon yellow suitcases. A few seconds later Violette and the boys start to pack other essential items. 15 minutes later Violette and the boys lock up the house. 3 minutes later their be-driven van pulls up in front of their house. A few seconds later Violette and the boys help the driver put their 7 neon yellow suitcases into the van. A few minutes later the van driver and the Anderson family speed off to JFK. A few hours later Violette and the boys walk into JFK. A few seconds later Violette and the boys check in. An hour later they drop their luggage off. 12 minutes later they pass through security safely. A few minutes later they find their gate. An hour later they board the plane. 20 minutes later they take off. 4 hours later they collect their 7 neon yellow suitcases. 3 minutes later Violette and the boys breathe in the delicious air of Florida. A few minutes later they rent a Tesla. 10 minutes later they speed off to their hotel. 30 minutes later they check in. 10 minutes later they park the SUV in a parking lot. 4 minutes later they walk into their room. A few seconds later they start unpacking. 15 minutes later they head to bed. 8 hours later Violette wakes up. A few seconds later Violette walks into the kitchen. 10 minutes later Violette shouts for the boys. 2 minutes later Violette and William each tuck into some protein shakes for breakfast. A few seconds later Violette hands Bill a bowl of parfait. Bill screams at the top of his lungs. 10 seconds later Bill throws his breakfast off the 8th floor. A few seconds later Violette explodes at Bill. Bill then walks into the kitchen. Violette then tells Bill he needs to get ready for the day. A few seconds later Violette and the boys get ready. 20 minutes later Violette tells the boys they are going skydiving. Bill then perks up when he realizes he can push Violette out of the airplane because of the parfait. Violette then says they are leaving now. 2 seconds later Violette and the boys walk down to the Tesla. 3 minutes later Violette and the boys speed off to an airport. 1 hour later Violette and the boys check in. 30 minutes later their plane takes off. 20 minutes later Violette and the boys line up with 3 other people. 3 seconds later Violette puts her parachute on. Violette then gets ready. 3 seconds later Bill picks up Violette. 4 seconds later Bill throws Violette out of the plane. Violette starts screaming very loudly. Bill then pushes William off the plane for no reason. William then starts praying because he wasn't able to get his parachute on. A few seconds later Bill dives. A minute later William and Violette try clinging to each other. 2 minutes later William hugs Violette for life. Violette then deploys the parachute. 2 seconds later Bill speeds past Violette and William. 3 minutes later Bill deploys his parachute. 8 minutes later Bill safely lands next to the terminal from where they boarded. A few minutes later Bill sees Violette and William slowly floating down. 4 minutes later Violette and William safely land. Violette then takes her parachute off. Violette and William then see Bill. 3 seconds later Bill starts running. Violette and William start chasing Bill. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys arrive at the Tesla. A few seconds later Bill sits on a bench. 1 minute later Violette and William throw Bill to the floor. A few seconds later Bill asks for lunch. Violette says they are going to a Chinese food buffet for lunch. Bill then gets up. 3 minutes later Violette and the boys speed off to the buffet. 10 minutes later Violette parks the SUV. A few seconds later Bill swings his door open, into a stranger's car. Violette then watches Bill speed off. Violette then walks over to see the damages. A few seconds later Violette sees the extent of how hard Bill swung the Tesla door open. A few seconds later the owner of the wrecked car walks up. He then sees the extent of what happened. Violette then explains her awful husband did it. Violette, William and the stranger walk into the buffet. 2 minutes later Violette sees Bill is shoving fistfuls of pasta into his mouth. A few seconds later Bill looks up. Bill then explains he ate 7 pounds of food. A few seconds later Violette punches Bill's jaw. Bill yelps in pain. A few seconds later Violette explains to Bill what he did when he ran into the buffet. A few seconds later Bill runs into the kitchen. A few seconds later Bill runs out with a 30-pound bag of flour. A minute later Bill screams with pure anger while he rips the bag apart. A few seconds later Bill slams the bag onto the floor. Less than a second later, flour explodes everywhere. Then a massive cloud of flour quickly fills the buffet. Violette and William then drag Bill out of the buffet. 2 minutes later they speed back to the hotel they are staying at. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk into their family suite. A few seconds later Violette slaps Bill for wasting 30 pounds of raw flour. 3 seconds later Violette asks why she was pushed off the airplane. Bill says it was revenge for the parfait. Violette looks at Bill with utter confusion. 2 seconds later Violette looks at Bill with utter frustration. Bill then walks away. A few seconds later William starts playing Minecraft. 10 seconds later William gets eliminated from fall damage. 1 second later William crashes onto his bed. A few seconds later William starts peacefully playing Minecraft. A few seconds later Bill walks into William's hotel room with some of William's assignments from MAHS. A few seconds later William powers down his Xbox. 20 seconds later William grabs the papers. 1 minute later William places the assignments in the sink. William then turns the faucet on. A few seconds later William's assignments start dissolving. A few seconds later William tells Violette he is never doing those lousy useless assignments. Violette then screams with utter anger. William then starts pleading. Violette slaps William's face with all her might. A few seconds later a red hand imprint appears on William's face. A few seconds later Bill walks into the kitchen to see what the commotion is. Bill then screams with anger when he sees the sink. Bill then kicks William's booty. William yelps in pain. Violette then laughs her head off. A few seconds later William walks back to his bedroom. 2 minutes later William starts screeching scary death threats at his Xbox. A few seconds later a manager walks into the family suite where the family is staying. The manager then walks into William's bedroom. Violette and Bill then walk in. A few seconds later the manager tells Violette the family is getting a strike. The manager then says if they get 3 strikes they would be kicked out of the hotel. Bill looks at William. William then shuts his pie hole. A few seconds later the manager leaves. Violette and Bill then start scolding William. A few seconds later William pushes his parents out of his hotel room. Violette and Bill then walk away. 2 seconds later William's Fortnite teammate accidentally kills William in game. William then screams you are a worthless, ugly, useless bastard. No one loves you. Stop existing or else I will hunt you down in real life. Then break into your house at 2 AM to do something. You are wretched. Go bleep off. Nobody cares about you. I am going. Violette then barges into William's bedroom. Violette then starts scolding William. William tries lying. 3 seconds later Violette growls at William. William then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Violette walks away. William then resumes raging. 2 minutes later William gets eliminated again. William then throws a lamp at the TV. 1 second later the lamp crashes into the TV. 2 seconds later the TV slams onto the floor. Violette then feels it. 2 seconds later Violette speeds to William's room. 3 seconds later Violette sees the lamp and TV. Violette then sighs with sadness. A few seconds later Bill walks into William's bedroom. A few seconds later Bill screams with horror. Violette then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later Violette stomps away. 2 minutes later Violette tells William he is going to be grounded when they return home. A few seconds later William says he will do anything to make up for the TV and lamp. Violette then perks up. A few seconds later Violette tells William he has to do 28 chores a day for 4 months. William then screams with horror. Violette and Bill then walk away. A few seconds later Violette starts cooking dinner, while the boys take a nap. 20 minutes later Violette calls for the boys. A few seconds later Bill sprints into the kitchen. Violette then hands Bill a bowl of pulled pork. Bill perks up. A few seconds later William walks into the kitchen. Violette then hands William a peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich on burnt toast. Violette then tells William she put hot dogs, Smarties, Cocoa Puffs, goldfish, 2 ounces of random seasonings, pickles, blue rare salmon, spaghetti, garbage stew, rotten pork, party cheese salad, lazy man enchiladas and some baked beans. William then walks to the deck. A few seconds later William throws his sandwich off the deck. Violette then nags and scolds William for his behavior. A few seconds later William starts watching videos on his temporary phone. A few minutes later Violette and Bill start watching TV. 3 hours later Violette and the boys head to bed. 8 hours later Violette wakes up to the sound of glass breaking. Violette then turns her head to see Bill is not in bed. Violette then gets out of bed. She then grabs her whip. 12 seconds later Violette sees a window was broken. Violette then sees Bill with a hammer in his hands. Bill then runs away. 12 seconds later Violette tackles Bill. A few seconds later Bill explains why he smashed a window. A few seconds later Violette drags Bill. A minute later Violette places Bill onto a couch. Violette then starts whipping Bill's booty. A few minutes later William walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later William grabs a box of cereal. William then walks back to his bedroom. A few seconds later William powers up the new TV that was just put in his hotel bedroom. Back in the living room, Violette is starting to whip Bill even harder. 10 minutes later Violette starts whipping Bill as hard as she can. 3 minutes later Violette switches hands. She then starts whipping even harder. 18 minutes later Violette finishes whipping Bill's booty. Bill then walks to the kitchen. 1 minute later Violette walks into the restroom. A few seconds later Bill grabs a gallon jug of vegetable oil. 3 seconds later Bill starts chugging the veggie oil. 2 minutes later Bill finishes chugging. 3 seconds later Violette walks into the kitchen. Bill then knows he is dead meat. A few seconds later Violette roars at Bill for chugging 8 pounds of vegetable oil. Bill then feels a little upset in the stomach region. Bill then grabs a gallon of apple juice. 3 seconds later Violette starts chugging the apple juice. 3 minutes later Bill finishes chugging his apple juice. Bill then confidently says his stomach will be much better. A few seconds later Bill's stomach fluid turns into a hurricane. Bill then runs to the deck. A minute later Bill starts hurling off the deck. 10 minutes later Bill walks back into the hotel suite. Violette then tells Bill to shower. Bill walks to the shower. 20 minutes later Violette turns the living room TV off. She then wanders over to the shower. A few seconds later Violette sees Bill is still in the shower. Violette then says they are going swimming. Bill turns the shower off. Violette then walks over to see William. 10 seconds later Violette sees William is watching Jawtooth on his temporary phone. A few seconds later Violette tells William they are going to go down to the outdoor pool. William perks up. William then closes his bedroom door. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk down to the pool. A few minutes later Violette and the boys jump into the pool. 2 hours later Violette and the boys dry off. A few minutes later they order lunch. 3 minutes later Violette roars at Bill for ordering 8 2.5-pound family bundle meals. Bill then says he is starving. A few seconds later Violette sighs. Violette then roars at Bill for ordering 35 pounds of crab. 30 minutes later Bill's food comes out. Bill screams with excitement. A few seconds later Bill starts eating his 8 family meals. A few seconds later Violette and William's thin crust pizza comes out. A few seconds later Violette and William tuck into their pizza. 10 minutes later Violette and William finish eating. They then pay the waiter for their $184 meal. A few minutes later Violette and William jump into the pool while they wait for Bill. Bill then starts chugging 16 liters of pop while forcing 20 pounds of food down his throat. 15 minutes later Violette tells Bill they are leaving. Bill says he is finished. Violette and William then dry off. Bill then puts his shirt on. 2 minutes later Violette tells Bill he is going to be weighed when they get into the hotel room. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk back to their room. 10 minutes later Violette watches Bill get onto his talking scale. A few seconds later the scale says Bill weighs 274 pounds. Violette then roars at Bill for gaining 104 pounds in about 1 week. Bill then says he likes food. Violette then looks at Bill with utter anger. A few seconds later Violette and Bill walk to the kitchen. A few seconds later Violette hears weird gibberish coming from William's bedroom. A few seconds later Violette walks over to William's bedroom. 3 minutes later Violette finishes nagging William for using death threats. 2 minutes later William powers down his Xbox. A minute later Violette and the boys watch Jawtooth. 5 hours later Violette walks into the kitchen to cook supper. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys tuck into some Kraft mac and cheese and some Ben's original microwavable rice packets. 10 minutes later Violette asks Bill to wash every dish in the sink. Bill then sees dishes are overflowing in the sink. Bill yelps with horror. A few seconds later Bill rips the dishwasher door open. Violette and William guard Bill. A few seconds later Bill starts throwing dishes into the dishwasher. Violette then tells Bill he has to take the rack out. Bill then smashes a dish on the floor. 2 seconds later Violette and William scold Bill while he continues making a complete mess with the dirty dishes. 3 minutes later Bill dumps a gallon of dish soap into the dishwasher. Bill then starts a 3-hour-long cycle. A few seconds later a manager walks into the room. She then tells the Anderson family they got a second strike for Bill's family bundle chaos. She then walks away. Violette then sighs with embarrassment. A few seconds later Violette and William start packing up because they know they are about to be kicked out from Bill's behavior. 10 minutes later Violette and William finish packing the clothes. A few seconds later they walk into the kitchen, only to see a flood of soapy water. A few seconds later Violette shouts for Bill. Bill flies into the kitchen with a vacuum. Bill then starts vacuuming up the bubble ocean. 10 minutes later Violette opens the dishwasher. A few seconds later William starts removing dishes from the dishwasher. 2 minutes later Bill starts vacuuming up the dish fragments and soap out of the dishwasher. A few seconds later the hotel vacuum starts smoking. Violette then unplugs it. Bill then storms away with the vacuum. 20 seconds later a massive crash shakes the hotel. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill it is bedtime. Bill then gives in. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk to their rooms. 12 hours later Violette and the boys eat some breakfast. A few seconds later the CEO of the hotel barges into the Anderson family hotel room. The CEO then tells the family they are kicked out. Violette and the boys then walk out with their 7 neon yellow suitcases. An hour later they walk into an airport after dropping the Tesla off. 2 hours later they board a flight to Logan Airport. 4 hours later they collect their bags. A few minutes later they get into a cab. 6 hours later Violette and the boys walk into the house after a crazy vacation gone wrong. A few minutes later Violette and the boys finish unpacking. They then have a snack. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys head to sleep. 8 hours later Violette and William walk downstairs. 10 minutes later Violette and William speed off to MAHS. A few minutes later William walks into MAHS. William then walks to his special ed class with Ms. Potato. 3 minutes later Ms. Potato hands William a piece of paper. William then sees he has to handwrite a 78,000 word report on why MAHS is awesome. William then roars with pure anger. Ms. Potato says it is required to graduate. William then punches Ms. Potato's jaw. A few seconds later William speeds out of his special ed class. 1 minute later William gets scolded by Zach. Zach then says to William that he is calling Violette. William screams with horror. Zach then calls Violette. 2 minutes later Zach ends the call. 3 minutes later Violette slaps William. Zach explains that William is getting expelled for bullying and cutting class. William screams with excitement. Violette then roars with anger. A few seconds later Violette drags William by the arm to her SUV. 2 minutes later Violette and William speed home. 30 seconds later Violette and William walk into the house. William then races upstairs to play Xbox. 10 seconds later Violette sighs. A few seconds later Bill walks out of the bathroom. Violette then tells Bill that William got expelled from MAHS. Bill then storms upstairs. A minute later Violette hears William crying. Violette then walks upstairs. A few seconds later Violette sees Bill has shot William's booty with a BB gun. A few seconds later Violette roars her head off. Bill then says he has to get to work. William then watches Violette and Bill enter their bedroom. William then grabs a blowtorch and light a fluid bottle from his arson chest. 2 minutes later Violette roars at William. Bill then screams when he sees William has torched his bucket of work tools. A few seconds later Bill tells Violette there was about $8,000 of tools that he has to replace. Violette then slaps William. A few seconds later Violette walks inside. A minute later Bill speeds off after he doused the fire. William then walks into the house. 2 seconds later William walks upstairs. A few seconds later William places the lighter fluid and blowtorch back in his arson chest. William then starts playing Xbox. 3 seconds later Violette watches TV. An hour later Bill walks into the house. Bill then tells Violette he got fired for embezzlement. A few seconds later Violette shouts at Bill. Bill then starts crying like a baby. 1 month later Violette and the boys are packing up for an overnight stay in New York City. A few minutes later Violette and the boys start placing their suitcases into the trunk of Violette's SUV. 10 minutes later Violette locks the house up. 3 minutes later they speed off to New York City. 5 hours later Violette and the boys check into their hotel. 20 minutes later they walk into their hotel room. A few minutes later they walk to the SUV. 10 minutes later they speed off to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. 20 minutes later Violette and the boys park the SUV. A few minutes later they arrive at the 9/11 Memorial. A few seconds later Violette and William start crying a little because of the memorial. A few seconds later Bill starts laughing because people lost their lives. Violette then tells Bill he is a disgusting excuse of a human. A few seconds later Violette and William walk around and explore. Bill then screams that 9/11 was a hoax made by the government. A few seconds later Bill starts dancing disrespectfully next to the memorial. A few seconds later Violette and William run to Bill. A few seconds later Bill starts screaming very offensive things against the victims of 9/11. 3 seconds later a massive mob surrounds Bill. Bill then tries lying his way out of his hate crime. A few seconds later a police officer arrests Bill for disrespecting the 9/11 memorial and victims. The police officer then says Bill is arrested for 1 week. Violette then sighs with utter embarrassment. A few seconds later Violette and William walk to the SUV. 10 minutes later they pack up their stuff. An hour later they check out. A few minutes later Violette and William speed home. A few weeks later Violette is setting up the final decorations for Anderson family Halloween setup. A few minutes later Violette walks into the house. A few seconds later Violette screams with horror when she sees Bill's costume. A few seconds later Bill tells Violette he is going trick-or-treating as Ghostface. A few seconds later Bill grabs a tool bag full of weaponry and construction tools. Bill then grabs a meat cleaver. A few seconds later Violette hands Bill a plastic toy knife. Violette then grabs the meat cleaver from Bill. A few seconds later Violette watches Bill walk outside. Violette then cries because she knows Bill is going to bring chaos and torment to Mount Airy. A few seconds later Bill walks over to the neighbor's house. A minute later Bill asks for candy. Then the neighbor walks inside her house while laughing. Bill then takes out a hammer. A few seconds later Bill smashes a window. He then sprints away. 3 minutes later Bill walks up to a mansion. He then rings the bell. A few seconds later someone comes out. 3 seconds later Bill gets the front door slammed in his face. Bill then screams with anger. Bill then takes out a pickaxe. A few seconds later Bill starts smashing up a Ferrari for no reason. 2 minutes later Bill sprints away. A few moments later Bill asks for candy from yet another house. Bill then gets scolded at. A few seconds later the house owner walks back into the house. A few seconds later Bill takes out a stick of dynamite. A few seconds later Bill places the dynamite in the homeowner's car. Bill then lights the dynamite up. Bill then finds cover. 10 seconds later the dynamite explodes. Bill then runs away. 10 minutes later Bill walks up to his 18th house. A few seconds later Bill takes out a flamethrower. Bill then lights a car on fire. A few seconds later Bill lights several trees on fire. 1 minute later Bill runs away. 8 minutes later Bill arrives at his 31st house. A few seconds later Bill takes out C4. A few seconds later Bill runs away after lighting it up. A few seconds later the people in the house run to the street. A few seconds later the house blows up. Bill then walks home. Meanwhile, Violette is watching TV. She then turns on the news. A few seconds later she sees a headline called Rebel Teen in a ghost face costume is bringing chaos to Mount Airy. Violette then sighs because she knows Bill is up to no good. A few minutes later Bill walks into the house while looking a little toasty. Violette then grabs Bill's tool bag. A few seconds later Bill sees the living room TV has the news running. Bill then starts panicking a lot. Violette then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later William walks downstairs. Violette then tells William to call the police. William then calls the police while Violette starts to whip Bill. 10 seconds later Violette grabs her electrical whip. She then starts whipping Bill. 20 minutes later several FBI vans pull up in front of the house. A few seconds later CNN starts a national broadcast about the situation. A few seconds later Violette hides her whip. William and Violette then sit on Bill. A few seconds later Violette opens the front door. A few seconds later 8 FBI officials walk inside with a SWAT squadron. Bill then explains everything. 10 minutes later Bill gets arrested for committing several federal crimes. 3 minutes later everyone that came to the house for Bill speed away. A few hours later Bill's trial against the people of the United States of America. 8 hours later Bill is sentenced to be killed with a brazen bull. 10 years later Bill is killed with a brazen bull. Then Violette and William have amazing lives. The end. Conclusion. Hello there. I hope you enjoyed Tuffo 5.0. This was shorter because I need a break from writing Tuffo. My next big story will be my 5th Tom and Jerry spin-off. Then I will write Tuffo 6.0, which I plan on making close to 55,000 words to compensate for the shortness of Tuffo 5.0. Well, bye for now. More stories coming.